So to continue, each one of these areas needs to have a different pattern. You should have pattern sheets that look something like this, including the quiz that we took: 2 squares tall, 5 squares across, or 4 squares across and 2 squares tall. Remember to always keep your cover sheet handy, and also don't draw on it. So always have one of these handy, and then you can continue in pencil to lightly draw your patterns. So this is another one of my favorite patterns. I do it on all of my practice sheets. And very simply, it's kind of a curly Q or swirl pattern. One of the key things on this pattern is to make sure that they're touching, because we want to fill up as much of that space as possible, even if you do a couple of other random lines like that to fill up that space. I'm seeing a lot of these drawn super big inside some of the areas, and that is not how you were directed to do this project. So please make sure that they're smaller, but you have to be real careful. There's a limit to how small it can go also. And the reason, as I've said on numerous occasions, is that the final project is a coloring book page. Some of your patterns on some of yours, I have a student in one of my classes who did these little tiny circles, and they're so small they're almost thinner than the point on the pencil. That's not going to be able to be drawn over or colored over when we get to the coloring part of it. And these pages are intended to be coloring pages that students are going to upload to a site called Etsy, ETSY.com. On Etsy.com, you can upload individual drawings like this one. And as long as there's no solids, this one's pretty tiny right here, but as long as there's no solid filled in areas, they can be colored over. These big black marks here are already borderline a little too thick. And that was because I wasn't paying close attention to how hard I was pressing, or I possibly used a different marker to do those. We are going to do a thick line all the way around the hand and all the way around the letter, but not all the way around the frame. The intention of this is to cut this piece out with scissors and glue it onto a black piece of construction paper to frame it. Now the beauty of this project is that I can reuse this pattern elsewhere as long as it's not touching. So I'm going to zoom in some more here. When you have little tiny areas like this one, the best way to fill it in is to just do diagonal lines or little tiny circles, because that pattern is different from this one. Even though it has the same features, on this one I did the diagonal lines going from right to left. On this one I did them up and down. So again, this one isn't touching that one, so I can do this curly Q pattern inside this one also. Please make sure, this is critical, please make sure to draw these patterns very lightly. I've said it on numerous occasions, and I will continue to say it, that if you draw these lines too dark by pressing down really hard, it's going to be difficult for this ink pen to ink over the top of those lines. So draw your shapes and your lines very lightly inside those areas. So again, here's a small area here and there, kind of tiny. So I'm just going to use much more simple patterns. But I want it to be different from this pattern. So I'm going to do a checkerboard pattern, but please remember, even on a checkerboard pattern, we're not doing solids. So on a standard checkerboard pattern, every other square would be darkened in. In our case, we don't want completely filled in lines, and so I'm going to very carefully go in here and do diagonal lines like this. If you want them to be a little bit darker, you can use cross hatching. So each one of these little lines is called a hatch mark, H-A-T-C-H. If you want it to be a little bit darker, you can do what's called cross hatching. Cross hatching, simply put, is to do hatch marks in one direction and then come back and cross them in the other direction. This makes that area darker than some of the other areas around it, but it doesn't completely fill in the white space. And that white space is going to be critical when we color these, because even though it's dark or darker than the white squares around it, it still can be colored on, both on the computer and also by hand, if people choose to download these, print them out, and color them by hand. So another pattern that you can do in smaller spaces is to do a series of small circles. This is about as small as you want these circles to be. If you go too small on these circles, when you start to ink this page, those little tiny circles will fill in and it will turn into a muddy mess. Also notice that I'm getting slightly larger as I do the circles going out this way. So they started kind of small over here, but I'm increasing the size just a little bit as it goes up into this space. And again, I'm also not going to color in or darken in the space in between the circles. I'm just going to leave the circles alone. One of my other favorite patterns, which is fun to fill in small spaces like this, is what's called a vine pattern. And it's called a vine pattern because it starts with a simple line, and then you draw these leaves in all of these areas, including the stem, so that it looks like a vine. This one I'll actually do in another place because it's one of the ones that I really like to draw. As I've mentioned many times, one of the aspects of this type of art is the contemplation or meditation aspect. What that means is, as you continue to draw all these shapes, depending on how repetitive they are, it can get very mesmerizing. I'm going to go ahead, since this one's a small one. And what I mean by mesmerizing is you kind of get into a point where you can sit down and start doing patterns like this, and the next thing you know, several hours have gone by. It's very easy to lose track of time. So again, I want to make sure to vary the patterns. Since this is a really large space here, I'm going to continue the vine pattern or the leaf pattern inside this area, beginning with some vines that cover the whole space, all the way down into the fingers like this. And again, very simply, You can rotate your paper around any way you need to. Just make sure to keep your cover sheet handy. And once I've got the vines in there, now I can start drawing the leaves. Note that I'm still drawing very lightly. The two ways that you can do the leaves on here is you can either fill the space with leaves and then draw the stem to the vine, or the method I like is to actually start with the stem and then draw the leaves like that. Either way is perfectly acceptable. One other way that you can fill up some of this blank space in here is to add another stem off of the leaf and add berries. And again, the berries can be one berry, they can be two berries, they can come off the leaves, they can come off the stems or off the vine. But it's a great way to fill in some of this empty space in between everything. So again, you can start with the leaf and then draw the twig that goes to the vine, or you can start with the twig and do the leaf like that. This is where I could add some really cool music, because it's fun to do this type of thing, in my opinion, having music playing. But you got to be real careful, especially if you post these on YouTube, because you can't just put any music that you find online on your YouTube channel, as there are copyright issues. You can also continue to do leaves from other leaves like I'm doing right here. And then fill in the empty spaces with more berries. One of the things that I see a lot of students do is they want to draw these leaves really big inside this space because they think if they fill up the space quicker, it's less work. And it is in fact less work, but it's also one of those cases where I may ask them to add something to it, like I'm doing with all these berries, or even put lines, like diagonal lines, in between the spaces so that it can be more dense. All of these patterns are fairly dense, meaning they're very close together. And that just makes for a more interesting and I think more sellable coloring book page. So any place you have all these little tiny spaces, just add some berries. And the berries can go either to the vine or they can go to the leaf like this. It just all depends on where the space is that you're trying to fill in. Turns into sort of a maze also, because you can kind of imagine a bug crawling on this vine. Well, maybe I can imagine a little bug crawling on the line. I do have a fairly active imagination. But you sort of can get the idea as you're doing this of the meditative or contemplative nature of this type of art, which is a great way to wind down after a long day of work or school. The drawing of it, as well as the coloring of it, which we will do later. And I'm going to be walking through the entire process from start to finish of producing these pages, uploading them to a site like Etsy, and then linking them to my website so that other people can order, download, and color these pages either electronically or physically. Physically meaning download them and print them on your printer at home, and then color them with crayons or colored pencils or markers, and also coloring them on the computer.